It was supposed to be the happiest day of his life. Ethan Harris, a charming 32-year-old entrepreneur, was getting married to the love of his life, Jessica Mitchell. They had planned this day for months, each detail carefully thought out to ensure perfection. The grand ceremony was being held at the elegant Crystal Rose Chapel, a prestigious venue tucked away in a quiet neighborhood in Charleston, South Carolina. Guests from both sides filled the pews, the scent of fresh flowers filling the air. The sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, casting a soft, colorful glow on everything. Jessica, stunning in her white dress, smiled nervously as she stood at the altar. Her heart raced with excitement as she waited for Ethan to join her. But Ethan wasn't the only one with nerves on this fateful day. In the crowd, someone was watching with cold, calculating eyes. Amanda Simmons, Ethan's ex-girlfriend and the mother of his 5-year-old son, sat quietly in the back of the chapel, watching the ceremony unfold. She had always felt a burning resentment toward him ever since their breakup. Ethan had left her when she was pregnant, choosing to pursue his career in a new life without considering the responsibilities of fatherhood. Their son, Lucas, had become a reminder of the pain and betrayal she felt. The child, who barely knew his father, grew up with a single mother who had to fight every day to make ends meet. Ethan never provided support, and every attempt Amanda made to get him involved in their son's life had been met with silence. As she sat there, watching him exchange vows with someone else, the anger inside her boiled to the surface. She clenched her fists in the soft fabric of her dress, trying to keep herself calm, but she couldn't. The hurt, the anger, the injustice, it all bubbled up uncontrollably. Ethan had ruined her life and left her to raise their child alone. How could he move on so easily while she struggled every day? How could he ignore their son, who deserved a father? Amanda's face hardened. She had tried to contact him one last time to discuss their son's future, but he had refused to even acknowledge her. He had moved on, and now he was about to marry another woman, leaving Amanda feeling like an insignificant chapter in his life. With a final glance at Ethan, a cold smile crept onto her face. It was time to end this once and for all. Without a word, Amanda stood up from her seat and quietly made her way to the back exit. She had a plan. This wedding would not go as Ethan had hoped. This was the moment she had waited for, when he would finally have to pay attention to her, to the child they both shared. Amanda slipped into the shadows unnoticed by the guests who were still focused on the ceremony. She made her way to the back parking lot, where she had left her car. Inside the trunk, hidden beneath a blanket, was a gun. She knew exactly what she was going to do. The guests were lost in the romantic vows as the ceremony continued, unaware of the approaching storm. It was only when Amanda re-entered the chapel, walking down the aisle with a determined pace, that the atmosphere shifted. She had the gun concealed in her hand, and as she stepped closer, Ethan finally noticed her. His face went pale as realization hit him. "Amanda!" he whispered, his voice filled with disbelief. Before he could react further, Amanda raised the gun and fired. The shots echoed through the chapel, sharp and deadly. 5 shots rang out in quick succession, each one hitting Ethan in the chest. He collapsed onto the ground, blood pooling beneath him. Screams erupted, chaos ensued, and Jessica, in shock, was frozen in place. Amanda stood there, her hands still trembling from the recoil of the gun, her eyes locked onto Ethan's lifeless body. She had done it. She had made him pay. By the time the police arrived, the scene was chaotic. Amanda was arrested on the spot, but her mind was already far from the scene of the crime. She had made her point. Ethan had ignored her and their son for too long, and now he would never be able to ignore them again. The life he had been building was over, and she would finally have the attention she so desperately craved. As the investigation began, the first pieces of evidence were collected, but there were questions that no one had answers to yet. Why had Amanda been so violent? What had driven her to this extreme? The seasoned investigator, Detective Sarah Mills, was assigned to the case. She had seen many tragic stories in her career, but something about this case felt different. She knew that there was more to the story than the simple revenge killing Amanda had admitted to. The investigation was about to take a turn that no one could have predicted. Detective Sarah Mills arrived at the Crystal Rose Chapel shortly after the police secured the crime scene. The guests were gone, leaving behind nothing but the scent of flowers and the unsettling silence of a day that was meant to be filled with joy, now overshadowed by tragedy. Ethan Harris, once full of life, now lay motionless in the center of the altar, his white tuxedo stained with blood. The world that had been so perfectly arranged for his wedding had now come to a halt. Sarah took a deep breath as she walked through the chapel, examining the scene. Ethan's body was carefully covered with a white sheet, but there was no mistaking the violence that had taken place. 5 bullet wounds to the chest. The gun, a .45 caliber, was still in Amanda's possession when the police arrived. There was no doubt in anyone's mind that she was the one responsible. However, Sarah knew better than to make assumptions based on the immediate evidence. Her job was to dig deeper, to find out why this woman, a mother to Ethan's son, had resorted to such drastic measures. There was more to the story, something that didn't quite add up. Amanda's confession seemed too straightforward, almost too clean. What led her to this moment of rage? Sarah stepped outside, her eyes scanning the small crowd of officers gathered in the parking lot. She walked toward Officer Harris, the officer who had been first on the scene. He was young and nervous, but his eyes showed a clear determination to do his job right. "Any new details?" Sarah asked, her tone calm but firm. "Not much," Officer Harris replied, wiping his brow. "Amanda admitted to everything. She walked in, pulled out the gun, and shot him. No hesitation. No one saw it coming, even though she'd been sitting in the back during the ceremony. She didn't seem out of place until she walked up the aisle." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "And what about the gun?" "The gun was registered to her. We found it in the trunk of her car, right where she said it was. No sign of it being used by anyone else." Sarah's brow furrowed. "Okay, let's talk to the witnesses. I need to know more about her, about Ethan, and about their relationship. This isn't adding up. There's something we're missing." The investigation began with questioning those closest to the case: Jessica Mitchell, the bride, and Amanda Simmons, the shooter. Sarah knew that understanding their relationship with Ethan and their respective motives could help her piece together the puzzle. First, she spoke with Jessica. The bride was in shock, her face pale and eyes red from crying. She sat in a quiet room at the chapel, away from the hustle of the scene. Jessica had been in love with Ethan for 2 years, and she had been looking forward to their wedding day, believing that they had a future together. Her voice trembled as she recounted the events. I don't understand it," Jessica said, wiping her eyes. "I knew about Amanda, but I thought it was over. Ethan always told me that she was in the past. They had a son, but that was all. He promised me that we were moving forward together." Sarah took a seat across from her. "Did Ethan ever mention having any ongoing contact with Amanda? Any recent communication?" "No," Jessica replied quickly. "Not at all. I mean, he would occasionally tell me about their son, but it was always brief. I never felt like he was still tied to her. I thought they had their issues, but I didn't think she'd do something like this." Jessica's voice cracked, and Sarah could hear the pain in her words. She seemed genuine, but Sarah knew better than to rule out anyone as a suspect just yet. The motive wasn't clear. Jessica's grief was real, but was there more to this story than just a jealous ex? Next, Sarah turned her attention to Amanda. She was being held in an interrogation room at the local precinct, her head bowed, her body slumped in the chair. She had confessed to the murder without hesitation, but her demeanor was far from cold. There was a sense of exhaustion in her eyes, as if the weight of her actions had drained her completely. "Amanda, I know you're going through a lot right now," Sarah began, sitting across from her. "But I need you to understand that this is bigger than just what happened in that chapel. We need to figure out why you did this." Amanda looked up slowly, her eyes vacant. "You don't understand," she said quietly. "Ethan ignored me for so long. I begged him to help with Lucas. I begged him to be a father. But all he did was move on with his life. He never cared about our son. Never." Sarah kept her voice steady. "Tell me what happened the night before the wedding. Did you speak to Ethan?" Amanda's face twisted with frustration. "I tried to call him again. I wanted to talk about Lucas. I wanted to see if he'd finally step up and be a dad. But he wouldn't pick up, and the next thing I know, he's getting married. To someone else. He didn't even bother to tell me. She paused, tears welling up in her eyes. I was at the wedding to see if he'd finally acknowledge me. Finally acknowledge Lucas. But he didn't. He didn't care. So I made him care. I made him feel what I've felt all these years. Sarah listened intently. Amanda's anger was clear, but was it enough to drive her to murder? Was it justifiable for a mother to take such extreme measures to force a man to acknowledge his responsibilities? As Sarah left the interrogation room, she was left with more questions than answers. Amanda's pain was real, but so was Ethan's silence. The pieces were starting to fit, but there was still something missing, something deeper that Sarah needed to uncover. Was this a crime of passion fueled by years of rejection, or was there a more sinister layer beneath Amanda's rage? Sarah knew she had to dig deeper. She wasn't going to rest until she uncovered the truth. Detective Sarah Mills spent the following days carefully combing through the evidence, trying to uncover the hidden truths behind Amanda's confession. Though Amanda's motives seemed straightforward, anger, betrayal, and the desire to make Ethan pay for his years of neglect, something about it didn't sit right with Sarah. No matter how many times she went over the case, the pieces didn't align perfectly. Amanda had clearly been hurt by Ethan's rejection, and the overwhelming emotions that had culminated in the shooting were not to be dismissed. Yet Sarah could sense that there was more to the story. Could there have been another reason for the eruption of violence? Or perhaps, as the seasoned detective knew all too well, Amanda had been hiding something deeper, something she wasn't willing to admit. It was time to look into Ethan's life more closely, to piece together the gaps in his relationship with Amanda and his newfound relationship with Jessica. Sarah needed to understand Ethan's character, his actions, his decisions, and the choices that had brought him to this tragic day. For that, she would need to go beyond the surface of their past. The first step in Sarah's investigation was to revisit Ethan's social and professional connections. She started by talking to people who had known him well, from his friends and colleagues to the people who worked closest with him. Ethan was well-liked, a man who had made a name for himself as a successful entrepreneur in Charleston. His business, Harris Innovations, focused on tech and development, and it had seen rapid growth over the past few years. He was known as someone who had a vision, someone who was determined and ambitious, qualities that had impressed Jessica when they first met. Ethan's friends painted a picture of a man who was always forward-thinking, constantly looking for the next big opportunity. But when it came to his personal life, things were less clear. He'd kept a lot of it private, even from those who had known him for years. Sarah knew that. Sometimes the key to solving a case lay in the things people chose to hide. Her next stop was Ethan's office at Harris Innovations. The company was located in a sleek, modern building in the downtown area, with glass walls and open spaces that exuded professionalism. Ethan had a dedicated staff who seemed to respect him, but as Sarah walked through the office, she was struck by the lack of any personal touch. His desk was neat and impersonal, with no family photos or personal mementos to indicate the kind of life he had outside work. A young woman named Laura Mitchell, one of Ethan's senior assistants, was the first person to speak with Sarah. She seemed eager to cooperate, but there was a subtle hesitation in her eyes that didn't go unnoticed. Sarah asked Laura about Ethan's personal life, about his relationship with Amanda, and whether she knew of any recent issues. Ethan wasn't exactly open about his personal life, Laura said, her tone careful. But I did overhear some conversations. He was under a lot of pressure recently, mainly because of, well, his son, Lucas. He'd been getting letters from child support agencies and some legal notices. I don't think he took it seriously, though. He was so focused on his business that I don't think he gave much thought to his responsibilities as a father. Sarah felt a pang of realization. It was clear that Ethan had been ignoring the mounting issues with Amanda, and he had even been avoiding the legal responsibilities that came with being a parent. The letters that Laura mentioned sounded like they could have been part of the larger problem, the ongoing tension between Ethan and Amanda that had only escalated over time. Did Ethan ever talk about getting custody of Lucas? Sarah asked. Laura shook her head. No, not that I know of, But I did hear him say once that Amanda was, well, she was a problem for him. He was frustrated with her constant demands. He wanted to be free of that responsibility, I think. Sarah scribbled a note in her book. It seemed as though Ethan had been feeling cornered. On one hand, he had a business to run, and on the other, a child he didn't want to acknowledge. With this new information, Sarah revisited Amanda's statements. Amanda had mentioned reaching out to Ethan repeatedly, trying to get him involved in Lucas's life. But Ethan had remained silent. Was it possible that the pressure from the legal troubles had caused Ethan to shut Amanda out even more? Sarah knew that for Amanda, the situation had probably felt like an impossible battle, a fight for her son's future with little to no support from the man who had helped create him. To dig deeper, Sarah decided to get a look at Ethan's phone records, hoping to uncover any evidence of missed calls or messages that might shed light on his intentions toward Amanda. What she found shocked her. While Ethan had not responded to Amanda's calls, there were several text messages from a number labeled unknown, which he had saved but never replied to. The texts were cryptic, asking if he was ready to make things right, or telling him, "You can't run from this forever." Sarah couldn't help but wonder if these messages were from Amanda, or if someone else was trying to push Ethan into taking responsibility for his son. The next day, Sarah paid another visit to the jail where Amanda was being held. This time, Amanda's expression was different. She wasn't just angry anymore. She seemed resigned, almost defeated. She had been expecting this moment, and the reality of it had sunk in. "Amanda, I found something," Sarah began, taking a seat across from her. "I've been looking into Ethan's life, and it seems like there were some things you didn't tell me." Amanda looked up, her face blank. "What are you talking about?" "The texts. Ethan received messages asking him to make things right. Did you send those messages?" Amanda's eyes flickered with something: anger, fear, guilt. But she remained silent. "Amanda, I'm not accusing you of anything, but I need to know everything. You've been fighting for Lucas's future. But if you've been hiding something, this might change how we view the situation." Amanda's eyes darted away. For the first time, she seemed unsure of herself. Her silence spoke volumes. Sarah could tell that Amanda wasn't just a scorned lover. There was something deeper at play here, something that had been building beneath the surface for years. The investigation was far from over. As Sarah left the jail, she felt like she was getting closer to understanding the complexity of this case. But the final piece of the puzzle was still missing. The question remained: was Amanda's violent outburst truly the result of years of rejection, or was there something more sinister at the heart of this tragedy? Detective Sarah Mills sat in her car outside the Charleston courthouse, the morning sun casting long shadows across the parking lot. She had just finished reviewing the case files for Amanda's trial, and despite everything she had uncovered so far, the more she delved into Ethan's past, the more complex the case became. There was still something elusive, something that made Sarah feel like she was missing a piece of the puzzle, a piece that could shed light on the truth behind Ethan's murder. She knew Amanda's anger was justified in some respects. After all, Ethan had abandoned her and their son, neglecting his fatherly duties. But it wasn't just about that anymore. It was about who Ethan really was. Something about the way people had described him, the way his friends and co-workers spoke of him, made Sarah uneasy. Ethan had been hiding something, or worse, someone. Her next course of action was clear. She needed to investigate Ethan's past relationships and any secrets he might have kept. It wasn't just Amanda's voice that needed to be heard. There were other pieces of the puzzle waiting to be uncovered, and Sarah was determined to find them. Sarah started with a phone call to Jessica, Ethan's fiancée. She needed to hear her side of the story, to understand what kind of man Ethan was behind the scenes. After all, if Amanda had been so deeply hurt by Ethan's rejection, Jessica's insight could prove valuable. Jessica agreed to meet Sarah at a local coffee shop later that day. When Sarah arrived, she found Jessica sitting by the window, her eyes tired but calm, almost as if she had expected this meeting. "Detective Mills, I know you're here to ask about Ethan, but I want to make something clear first," Jessica said, her voice steady. "Ethan was a great guy. He had his faults, but he loved me, and he loved Lucas. Well, in his own way." Jessica was in her late 20s, with blonde hair and a soft-spoken demeanor. She wore a simple black dress, and there was an air of sadness about her that Sarah couldn't quite place. Her eyes, though, told a different story. They were guarded, as if Jessica was holding something back. "I'm not here to accuse Ethan," Sarah said, keeping her tone neutral. "I need to understand what he was really like, especially in the weeks before his death. We know about his relationship with Amanda, but I need to know about his life with you. Did you know about his problems with her?" Jessica paused for a moment before replying, her fingers gently tapping the cup in front of her. Ethan didn't talk much about his past with Amanda. He always said it was complicated, that they were better off apart. But what he didn't tell me, what he didn't tell anyone, was that there was someone else he was involved with. Someone from his past who wasn't just a complicated ex. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. "Who was this person?" Jessica took a deep breath and leaned in closer, lowering her voice. "Her name is Leah. She was someone Ethan met a few years before he and I got together. I don't know much about her, but Ethan mentioned her once. I was curious and I did some digging. It turns out that Leah was, well, she was more than just a fling. Ethan was in love with her, and they were planning a future together. But then she vanished." "Vanished?" Sarah repeated, leaning in with interest. "What do you mean?" "She disappeared without a trace," Jessica explained, her tone somber. "One day Ethan came home and told me that Leah had left him. No explanation, no goodbye, just gone. I never heard her name again after that. It was as if she never existed. But what if she was still out there, involved in all this somehow?" Sarah scribbled notes, her mind racing. A mysterious woman named Leah, someone Ethan had once loved, had vanished. And now Jessica was suggesting that her disappearance might be connected to his murder. The pieces were beginning to fall into place, but they still didn't make sense. "I need to know more about Leah," Sarah said, her voice steady but urgent. "Can you tell me anything else? Any clue about where she went or why she disappeared?" Jessica shook her head. "I wish I knew. I've tried looking for her online, but I couldn't find anything. I just thought Ethan had moved on. But now, I'm wondering if that's why he was so distant toward the end. Maybe Leah came back. Maybe she was still a part of his life in some way, and Amanda found out about it." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. This new lead was intriguing. If Ethan had been secretly involved with someone from his past, someone who had vanished but might have returned, it could explain a lot about his actions in the final weeks leading up to his death. With Jessica's information in hand, Sarah's next step was to dig deeper into Ethan's life prior to his relationship with Amanda. She needed to find out more about this woman named Leah, where she had gone, why she had disappeared, and whether there was any connection between her and the events surrounding Ethan's murder. Sarah began her investigation by pulling up Ethan's old social media accounts and examining his past relationships. She came across a profile picture of Ethan with a young woman, her name listed as Leah Winters. A quick search revealed that Leah had worked in real estate and had lived in Charleston until a year before Ethan's death. She had suddenly left the city without any explanation, and her social media accounts had been deactivated shortly thereafter. Sarah contacted the local real estate agency where Leah had worked. After some persistent digging, she learned that Leah had left under strange circumstances. According to her former colleagues, Leah had been a talented agent, but one day she simply stopped showing up. Her colleagues had tried calling her, but there was no answer. There were rumors, of course. Some said she'd left the city for personal reasons. Others said it was due to family issues. But no one could give Sarah a definitive answer. The more Sarah dug into Leah's past, the more she realized that something didn't add up. The woman had vanished without a trace, and now she seemed to be at the center of a growing web of mystery. Why had she disappeared? And what role, if any, did she play in Ethan's murder? As Sarah pieced together the fragments of the story, she realized one thing. Ethan had been keeping secrets. Deep, dark secrets. The question was no longer just about Amanda's rage or her feelings of betrayal. It was about Leah, the woman who had been a ghost in Ethan's life, and whether her reappearance had somehow triggered the tragic events that led to Ethan's death. Sarah knew that this case was far from over. The web of lies was unraveling, But the truth, if she could find it, was still a long way off. Detective Sarah Mills sat at her desk, the dim light from the desk lamp casting long shadows across the clutter of files and documents. The latest revelation, the mysterious disappearance of Leah Winters, had left her with more questions than answers. As the pieces of the puzzle slowly came together, she realized the case was shifting in a direction she hadn't anticipated. Leah wasn't just a ghost from Ethan's past. She was someone who had been tied to Ethan in ways that were beginning to look far more dangerous than anyone could have imagined. Sarah knew she needed to find Leah, and she needed to do it fast. The clock was ticking, and every moment that passed made it harder to distinguish fact from fiction. Sarah's first lead came through a private investigator she had hired to track down Leah's whereabouts. After days of searching and following leads, the investigator managed to find out that Leah had recently reappeared in Charleston, under a new name and a new identity. She had been living in a quiet part of the city, far removed from the real estate world where she had once been known. The investigator's report confirmed that Leah had been in contact with Ethan just days before his wedding to Jessica. According to phone records, the two had exchanged multiple text messages and had even met in person on at least 2 occasions. This was the breakthrough Sarah had been waiting for. Sarah couldn't wait any longer. She needed answers, and the only way to get them was to confront Leah directly. She drove to the address the investigator had uncovered, a modest apartment in a less than glamorous part of town. It wasn't much, but it was a place to hide. Sarah knocked on the door, her hand clenched around the handle of her service weapon. She wasn't sure what she was walking into, but she knew it was going to be important. The door creaked open, and a woman with dark brown hair and an anxious expression stood in the doorway. She was wearing a simple hoodie and jeans, looking like someone who had been trying to stay out of the limelight. Leah Winters. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Leah stepped back, her eyes flicking nervously toward the hallway. "I don't know what you want from me," she said, her voice shaky. "I didn't do anything." "I'm Detective Mills," Sarah introduced herself, trying to keep her voice calm and authoritative. "I'm investigating the murder of Ethan Maxwell. I know you knew him. I need you to answer some questions." Leah's eyes widened in shock, and she took a step back. I I didn't want anything to do with that. I didn't want to hurt him. I Let's start from the beginning," Sarah interrupted, keeping her voice steady but firm. "Why did you disappear? Why did you leave Charleston without a word?" Leah hesitated, glancing over her shoulder as if searching for an escape. "It wasn't like that," she said, her voice trembling. "I had to leave. I had to get away. There were things happening that I couldn't control." "Things like what?" Sarah pressed, her patience beginning to wear thin. She couldn't afford to let Leah play games. Leah ran a hand through her hair and looked down at the floor. "Ethan, he wasn't who he seemed. Not after I left. I didn't know it at first, but when I came back into his life, when I found out he was getting married, I realized something wasn't right." "What wasn't right?" Sarah asked, her heart racing. This was the breakthrough she had been hoping for. He wasn't telling anyone the truth about his past," Leah said, her voice cracking with emotion. "The reason I left wasn't because I wanted to. I found out Ethan was involved in something dangerous, something I couldn't get out of once I knew." Sarah's pulse quickened. "What kind of dangerous thing?" Leah shifted uncomfortably. "I can't say much, but it was bigger than both of us. There were people involved, people who wouldn't let us go. When I tried to break free, they threatened me, threatened to hurt me and anyone I cared about. Ethan, he was part of it. He had no choice but to stay involved. I tried to tell him to get out. I thought he had, but I guess I was wrong." Sarah was silent for a moment, processing the weight of Leah's words. If Leah was telling the truth, then Ethan's murder wasn't just a crime of passion. It was something far more complicated, and someone out there didn't want the truth to come out. "I don't know why he got involved in all this," Leah continued, tears welling up in her eyes. "But I can tell you this much. When I left, I never wanted to come back. I didn't want anything to do with it. But Ethan, he wouldn't let go of the past. I warned him, but I guess he didn't listen." "Did you have any contact with him in the weeks leading up to his wedding?" Sarah asked, her tone sharp. Leah nodded, her face pale. "Yes. He reached out to me. He said he was getting married, but something felt off. He kept asking about me, about whether I would come back into his life. I thought maybe we could fix things, but I couldn't. And I knew if I showed up at that wedding, it would all come crashing down. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. What do you mean? What would come crashing down? I don't know, but Ethan was scared. He was terrified. He knew something bad was going to happen, and I think he was trying to protect me. He didn't want me anywhere near that wedding, and that's why I stayed away. Did you think Amanda was the one threatening him? Sarah asked, trying to piece the timeline together. Leah shook her head. Number, it wasn't her. It was something bigger than her. Something I don't fully understand. But I think Amanda got caught in the middle of it. Leah's story was starting to make more sense, but it was far from complete. She wasn't the only one with a motive, and someone out there was willing to go to great lengths to keep the truth buried. Sarah knew that if she was going to solve this case, she had to dig deeper into Ethan's past and into the dangerous people he had once been involved with. But there was one thing Sarah knew for sure. Ethan's murder wasn't a random act of violence. It was the result of a complex web of lies, secrets, and betrayals. And if Sarah was going to unravel it, she had to stay focused and trust that the truth would eventually come to light. Detective Sarah Mills returned to the station with more questions than answers after her conversation with Leah Winters. The pieces were coming together, but the bigger picture remained elusive. Every lead seemed to lead to more dead ends, and time was running out. The pressure was mounting, and Sarah knew she had to act quickly. Ethan Maxwell's death was tied to something much larger than a troubled love affair or a scorned ex-lover. Whoever was responsible for his murder wasn't going to stop at just one crime. The next step in Sarah's investigation was to dig deeper into Ethan's life, specifically his financial records, his business dealings, and the people he had been associating with in the months leading up to his death. His clean-cut, charming exterior had hidden a web of dark connections, and Sarah was determined to bring those secrets to light. The first breakthrough came when Sarah received a call from the forensic accounting team. They had gone through Ethan's financial records, and something stood out. Several large, unexplained transfers to offshore accounts in the weeks before his death. At first glance, the amounts didn't make sense. They were too large for a man in Ethan's position, especially someone who had been trying to distance himself from his past. But the numbers didn't lie. There was more to Ethan's story than anyone had known. Sarah felt a sense of unease as she looked at the records. One name kept popping up: Adrian McAllister. McAllister was a businessman with a shady reputation, someone who had ties to criminal organizations across the country. Ethan had been working with him, but no one had connected the two men until now. According to the records, Ethan had been funneling money into McAllister's accounts, and the transfers were linked to a series of illegal operations that involved money laundering, trafficking, and even arms deals. This wasn't the life Ethan had portrayed to the people around him, including Jessica. But what did this have to do with his murder? Sarah's next move was to confront McAllister. She knew he wasn't going to be easy to crack, but he was the missing piece of the puzzle. If anyone had the answers, it was him. Armed with the financial evidence, Sarah arranged a meeting with McAllister at one of his properties, a luxury penthouse with a panoramic view of the city. The man was nothing short of intimidating, but Sarah wasn't afraid. She had the truth on her side. When McAllister opened the door, his smirk was almost immediate. He knew exactly why Sarah was there. "Detective Mills," he said, his voice smooth. "I was wondering when you'd come knocking. Please come in. We have a lot to discuss, don't we?" Sarah entered, taking note of the opulence of the apartment. It was clear McAllister lived in luxury. The furnishings were expensive, the artwork priceless. It was a far cry from the small office and dimly lit rooms where she spent most of her days. She took a seat, not letting the extravagance distract her from the task at hand. "You've been funneling money through Ethan Maxwell's accounts," Sarah said, cutting straight to the point. "What's the connection?" McAllister didn't seem fazed by the accusation. He leaned back in his chair, swirling a glass of whiskey as if they were discussing the weather. "Ethan was a useful ally," he said calmly. "He had access to things that I needed, and in return, I made sure he had what he wanted. It's business, detective, nothing personal." "Business?" Sarah repeated. Ethan's been dead for over a week, and you think this is just business? You were involved in his death, weren't you? McAllister's face hardened, the smile slipping away. I'm not involved in anything you're talking about, he said sharply. You've got nothing on me, Mills. You can dig all you want, but you won't find any proof that I had anything to do with Maxwell's death. Sarah wasn't deterred. We know about the money transfers. We know you were involved in illegal operations. The question is, what did Ethan know, and why was he silenced? McAllister's eyes flicked to the door for a split second before he leaned in, lowering his voice. Ethan wasn't the sharpest tool in the shed. He got in over his head. He was a pawn, and when he started getting too close to the king, we had to take care of it. It's nothing personal, just business. Who pulled the trigger? Sarah asked, her voice low. Who killed Ethan? McAllister's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something behind his eyes. Fear? Guilt? You'll never get that answer, he said, his voice cold. And I suggest you stop asking questions you don't want the answers to. Sarah left McAllister's penthouse with more questions than when she entered. He was clearly hiding something, but he wasn't going to give up any answers without a fight. The connection between him and Ethan was undeniable, but the exact motive for the murder was still unclear. Was it the money, the business dealings, or was there something else at play, a deeper conspiracy that Sarah had yet to uncover? Back at the station, Sarah reviewed the notes from her meeting with McAllister. She couldn't shake the feeling that McAllister was lying, that he knew more than he was letting on. But there was one piece of the puzzle she hadn't explored fully: Leah Winters. Leah had mentioned in their earlier conversation that Ethan had tried to protect her, and there was something in her words that suggested he had been fearful in the days leading up to his death. But why? It was then that Sarah realized the one thing she had missed. The motive wasn't just about the money or business dealings. Ethan had gotten too close to the truth, and in doing so, he had put someone in danger. Someone who wasn't willing to let that happen. Someone who had a lot to lose. The investigation was about to take a new turn. The truth wasn't just buried in the past. It was right in front of her, and she was finally starting to see it. The connections were tighter than ever, and it was clear that Ethan's death was only the beginning of something much larger. Sarah knew she was getting closer, but with every step forward, the stakes were getting higher. Whoever was behind Ethan's murder would stop at nothing to keep their secrets hidden. But Sarah was determined to expose them all. Detective Sarah Mills sat in her office, the early morning sunlight streaming through the blinds. The weight of the case was becoming unbearable, but she was close. She could feel it in her gut. The truth was just within reach. After days of interrogating witnesses, analyzing evidence, and sifting through the chaos of Ethan Maxwell's life, Sarah finally connected the dots. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fit together in a way that painted a picture darker and more complicated than she ever imagined. She stood up and walked to the whiteboard in her office, her fingers tracing the lines and connections that linked Ethan, Leah Winters, Adrian McAllister, and the money laundering scheme. Each of them had played a role, but there was one more piece of the puzzle that she hadn't fully uncovered: the true mastermind behind it all. It was late in the afternoon when Sarah received a call that made her heart race. It was from Leah Winters. Detective Mills. Leah's voice trembled on the other end of the line. I need to tell you everything. I know who killed Ethan. Sarah's pulse quickened. She had suspected Leah was hiding something, but she hadn't anticipated this. Tell me what you know, Leah. It's time to set the record straight. Leah's voice was shaky, but there was urgency in her words. Ethan, he wasn't just involved in shady deals. He was trying to get out. He told me about McAllister, about the things they were involved in. He wanted to protect me and our son, but he didn't know who to trust anymore. He was scared. There was someone else behind it all, someone who didn't want him to leave. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. She knew where this was going. Who was it, Leah? It was Jessica, Leah said, her voice breaking. Jessica Monroe. She was the one pulling the strings. Sarah was stunned. Jessica Monroe, Ethan's fiancée, the woman who had seemed to have everything under control, who had been on the brink of marrying Ethan just days before his murder? How could it be her? Why? What was her motive? Sarah asked, trying to make sense of it. Ethan was going to expose everything, Leah continued, her words rushing out. Jessica was in on the money laundering. She was tied to McAllister and the illegal operations. She knew Ethan was going to cut ties with everyone and go public. He had planned to take everything to the authorities. She couldn't let that happen. She knew he was a threat to her future, her money, her lifestyle. She didn't just want him out of the picture, she wanted him dead. With the revelation from Leah, Sarah knew she had to act quickly. She rushed to the station, where she called for a search warrant for Jessica's apartment. Everything was falling into place. Jessica had been playing the part of the loving fiancé, but underneath it all, she was just as involved in the criminal activities as the rest of them. She was the one who had orchestrated Ethan's death, making sure that no one could stand in the way of her getting what she wanted. As Sarah and her team arrived at Jessica's upscale apartment, they were met with silence. The place was immaculate, but it felt cold, like everything in it was just for show. There was no sign of Jessica. Sarah's heart sank. She had a bad feeling about this. "We'll search the place," Sarah ordered, trying to stay focused. After an hour of combing through the apartment, Sarah's team discovered a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards. Inside, they found files, cash, and a journal detailing the operations that Jessica had been involved in. It was a treasure trove of evidence linking her to McAllister's illegal activities, including the money laundering, trafficking, and arms deals. But the most damning piece of evidence was a letter from Jessica to McAllister, written just days before Ethan's death. It was a letter discussing how Ethan was a liability and how something needed to be done to prevent him from exposing them. The next move was obvious. They needed to find Jessica before she disappeared for good. Sarah knew she wouldn't go down without a fight. She was too smart, too calculated. But with the evidence they had gathered, it was only a matter of time before Jessica would be caught. As Sarah prepared to head out for one final search, her phone rang. It was an unknown number. "This is Detective Mills," she answered, her voice tense. "Detective," a cold voice on the other end of the line said, "if you want to find Jessica Monroe, you'd better hurry. She's already gone. She's out of the country." Sarah's heart dropped. "Where is she?" The voice on the phone didn't answer directly. Instead, it gave an address, a secluded beach house in the next state over. The message was clear. Jessica was running, and Sarah had no time to waste. When Sarah and her team arrived at the beach house, they found it deserted. The door was unlocked, and inside there were signs of a hasty departure, scattered clothes, a half-eaten meal, and a suitcase left behind. It was clear that Jessica had known the end was near. She had fled, but not without leaving a trace. Sarah's instincts told her they were close. They just had to find her. After hours of searching the area, Sarah finally spotted something out of the ordinary. A small boat tethered to a dock was barely visible in the moonlight. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Jessica had gone out on the water. They followed the boat's trail, eventually finding Jessica on a small, uninhabited island. She was waiting for them, standing on the shore with a gun in her hand. The confrontation was tense, but Sarah knew this was the moment. She stepped forward, her voice firm. "Jessica, it's over. You can't run anymore." Jessica's face twisted with anger and fear. "You don't understand," she spat. "I did what I had to do. Ethan was a threat. I couldn't let him ruin everything. He was nothing but a pawn in my game. It's over, Jessica," Sarah said calmly. "Put the gun down." Jessica hesitated for a moment, the gun shaking in her hand. Then, without warning, she turned the weapon on herself. The sound of the shot echoed through the night as Sarah rushed forward. But it was too late. Jessica Monroe, the woman who had orchestrated Ethan Maxwell's murder and nearly destroyed everything in her path, was gone. The case was closed. Sarah Mills had uncovered the truth. Ethan's death had been a calculated move, orchestrated by the woman who had pretended to be his fiancée. The money, the lies, and the manipulation had all been a means to an end. Jessica had been willing to destroy everything, including the life of the man she once loved, just to protect her own. As Sarah stood at the edge of the water, looking out over the horizon, she felt a sense of finality wash over her. The case had taken its toll, but justice had been served, and for Ethan Maxwell at least, the truth had finally come to light.